Hello and welcome back to another episode of Age Better, where each week we take a deep dive into all the ways we can feel better, look better, live better, and yep, age better. I'm your host, Barbara Hannah Grufferman. Today I have a very special guest, Dr. Rhonda Garelick. Dr. Garelick is a renowned writer and cultural critic who writes the Face Forward column for the New York Times Style section. She holds the prestigious title of D.E. Hughes Jr. Distinguished Chair for English and Professor of Journalism at Southern Methodist University. But this fall, Dr. Garelick will embark on a very exciting new journey as the founding director of the Interdisciplinary Public Humanities Institute at Hofstra University in New York. Dr. Garelick is the author of 3 amazing books, including Mademoiselle, Coco Chanel, and the Pulse of History, and is currently working on a new book titled Why Fashion Matters, which delves into the intricate connections between fashion and politics. Her insightful writing has graced the pages of New York Magazine, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, The LA Times, Vanity Fair, and many other prestigious publications. A Yale University alumna and a Guggenheim fellow, Dr. Garelick brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to our conversation today about a national treasure, Dr. Ruth Westheimer. In this episode, we take a deep dive into Dr. Garelick's recent New York Times article, which was amazing, about the iconic Dr. Ruth, who recently passed away at the age of 96. We'll explore Dr. Ruth's extraordinary legacy, her impact on women's sexual health and empowerment, and her groundbreaking work in discussing sexuality openly and frankly and with humor, especially for older adults. Dr. Garelick also shares her personal experience meeting Dr. Ruth and the lessons that she learned from her over 30 years ago that still resonate with her today. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to Dr. Garelick's article in the New York Times, along with some other fun and engaging information about both Dr. Garelick and the incredible Dr. Ruth. So, you know what to do. Pop in your earbuds, take me with you while you take a heart-healthy walk, and enjoy this enlightening and inspiring conversation about the teeny tiny woman with a humongous presence who forever changed the way we talk about and think about sex and aging. Stay tuned.
Hey everyone, it's me, Drew Offwallow, host of the Comment Section Show. Come join me and one of my iconic special guests every week on the show as we dive into the dreaded comment sections of our tagged videos and take down the most terrible men on the internet, period. Somehow, they won't go away no matter what I do, no matter how incredibly awful and mean I am to them, but I don't mind doing this work. In fact, if I'm being honest, I think it's God's work. So make sure y'all follow me on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts for new episodes every Wednesday.
Join Capital Group CEO Mike Gitlin for a new edition of the Capital Ideas Podcast. In unscripted conversations with investment professionals, you'll hear real stories about successes and lessons learned, informed by decades of investment experience. It's your look inside one of the world's largest asset managers. New episodes are available monthly. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Invest 30 minutes in an episode today. Published by American Funds Distributors, Inc.
Hello, Dr. Garelick, and welcome to Age Better.
Hello, Barbara. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
So the world is really so sad right now because not too long ago, the world lost Dr. Ruth. And I know she was just such a spark of light and life in so many ways and for so many years. So many of us kind of grew up hearing about her or were already adults like me when she became quite famous. And she became quite famous only when she was about 50. But I asked you to come onto the show because you wrote this really great article about meeting Dr. Ruth about 30 years ago. And you interviewed her for what it turned out to be your first magazine article. What was the magazine that it was for?
The magazine was called Culture Front magazine, and it was the house magazine for the New York Council for the Humanities, which is still in existence and is a division of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the NEH. And I was program officer then. I had a job briefly working there, and one of my many tasks was editing that magazine, and then they gave me some writing to do for it. And Dr. Ruth had a new book out. It was about to come out called Heavenly Sex. And I was put on the case. And that's how that started.
Oh, that's really, really wonderful. And you were very lucky to have that kind of time with her because, as you also said in your article, she really started to kind of delve a little bit into your personal life, like who are you dating? Are you dating? How are you dating? Especially. So we do want to hear about that. What was your experience meeting her at that time, 30 years ago?
Well, I was a little nervous, I have to be honest. I had never done a profile for a magazine, certainly not a celebrity profile. And I met her at her office on way up in Grand Concourse, Washington Heights, Upper Bronx. And it was immediately clear that she was a very Hamish, if you know what I mean, lady. And she met me at the door. We got there at the same time. And she thrust her handbag into my hands and said, "Hold this," while she looked in it for her keys. So already I felt like I was her, her daughter, her niece, her neighbor. She had no formalities. And it was clear also that she was a deeply interpersonal lady. She ushered me into this extremely cluttered, very complicated space where she did see patients and also did her own writing. And it was filled with tchotchkes. It was filled with photographs and figurines and a lot of furniture. And as I mentioned in the article, underneath every seating area were these little footstools, which were clearly in place because Dr. Ruth was startlingly tiny. She was 4'7", and in order to sit comfortably and not have her feet dangle, she kept footrests under every chair.
I just have to tell you one thing. Sorry to interrupt your story, but I would say about 8 years ago, maybe, I went to a medical event. It was a cocktail party, actually. It was a fundraiser for this association. And she was there because she was very, very good friends with the woman who founded this organization. And so I had the pleasure of meeting her. And there was a photo of me. And I was wearing kind of high heel shoes, my normal. And I had to really bend down to kind of be in the same photo as her. It was amazing. She was tiny, teeny tiny.
One of the smallest people I've ever met, and one of the biggest also, because that's the other thing that I quickly noticed in her presence was that she filled up the space. Her personality was sparkling and bright and big and interpersonal, and she was right there with me. She knew, of course, this was an interview of herself, but she was just as interested in me and made clear that she was going to be asking questions as well.
And so she did.
And she did. She did.
Do you have like one memorable moment of your time that you spent with her?
Well, I thought about this. There were a couple, and I hadn't thought back to it for many years until, of course, her passing. And then it all just came flooding back to me, making me realize how influential a personality she really was. So one of the first strong memories that stayed with me was when she started asking me about my boyfriend and my work and my university studies. And she found all of these things interesting, but not equally acceptable. So she liked, for example, that I had a graduate degree and I was a professor at the time, but I had taken a leave from my job and I was living in New York doing this program officer job as a kind of experiment. But my normal job was in Colorado at the time, and she knew that my family all lived in the New York area because she asked me. And she then ascertained that I was a young woman living far from my parents and other family, and she did not think this was healthy or a long-term. Did not like that.
I agree. I tell this to my daughters every day.
Well, she felt strongly about that, but wasn't content just to tell me that. She immediately began thinking of where she might help get me a job as a professor and thought about universities where she could set up an interview for me. So that was startling because she really didn't know me, but she had decided she wanted to help me. And then she asked me about my love life, and she was completely matter of fact. She didn't apologize for asking, nor did I feel in any way transgressed by this. It seemed the most natural thing to fall into awfully personal chat with this lady I had never met. And she learned I had this long-term boyfriend, but no plans to marry him. She wanted to know why not. She wanted to know if I planned to marry him. Eventually, I found myself telling her all of these things, and then she decided what I needed, of course, was a new boyfriend. And
of course, we all want to know what happened to that boyfriend.
He's a lovely person. He's my dearest friend. And in fact, I'm having dinner with him tomorrow, but he is not my husband. My husband is a different person.
That's amazing. Oh, so she really knew. She understood right away that this was not going in that direction.
It wasn't going to be the last relationship of my life. And she knew that several years before I did. And she also asked me personal questions about religion. I was born to a Jewish family, but I'm an entirely secular person. But she thought that I should join a synagogue because that would be a way of having more spiritual connection, but also a great way to meet guys. And that was clearly a valid reason in her mind, and it is, frankly.
Yes, and you even, in the article in the New York Times, you even mention the synagogue that she proposed to you, which I have to tell you, 30 years, well, I've been married for 31 years, so let's say 35 years ago when I was still dating, because, I met my husband and we got married a year later, so it was very quick.
Mm-hmm.
So like 35 years ago, it was, I'm a New Yorker, it was considered the place to meet a nice Jewish guy, for sure.
B'nai Jeshurun is the synagogue in question. And I mentioned it specifically in the Times because I knew New York readers would recognize it, especially
right
Jewish New Yorkers. And that was famous for a place to meet, a progressive synagogue. So, yes.
It's really so great. How did she make you feel? Like, I'm so curious when she was kind of forcing you in a loving way, in a fun way, probably humorous way, as she was wont to do, to talk about all these personal things. How did that make you feel at that time? Was it coming easy for you, or did you feel like you were being put on the spot, or how did you feel?
I thought about this in advance of talking to you today, and I remembered very well that it was a kind of dual contradictory feeling that I had. I was surprised because I didn't expect so much interest and personal depth on my side in this conversation. And I'm a very open person on personal details. That's fine with me. That didn't bother me in the least. But I was concerned that maybe this was not professional, that I should veer the conversation back to her. But I also remember distinctly having this feeling like falling into water, like, okay, we're doing this. This is who she is. And I felt a kind of affection, almost even a protective affection for her. I didn't want to in any way disturb her preferences. And I remember thinking, I'm now just in the presence of someone who will steer this car, and I'm giving it over to her.
Yeah, go with the flow.
Yes,
and you did.
I did.
And you did. So she really did have an impact on you. Would you say that conversation with her, let's first take the boyfriend conversation. Do you feel that really was important to your ultimate decision to not continue along that path with him? Did that start something in your mind?
It did not start something, but in the way that good therapy works, it confirmed something. And I did find myself going back to that conversation in the years following when I had a decision to make. Mm-hmm. So definitely it planted some seeds. Mm-hmm. And it also resonated with me a little while later when I ultimately met my future husband. I was talking with a relative of mine, an older uncle of mine. And we were talking about uncles a moment ago, in fact, off camera. And I was thinking aloud with my uncle, beloved man, about whether I should marry that new boyfriend. And he said, come on, be happy this way. And that reminded me of Dr. Ruth. There was a kind of obvious, commonsensical, family-like interest in just seizing the moment, enjoying your life,
And not deep thinking
Right.
too
Not
much.
overthinking.
Not overthinking.
Not overthinking.
Yeah. I'm also curious about the professional conversation that you had. Like she wanted to set up some appointments at universities and the like. Did anything come from that?
Not that particular thing, but it did wind up that I made my way eventually home to New York City, where I ultimately did find a professor job. I've moved around since then, but as it happens, I am returning to a new job that will put me permanently back in my hometown of New York City, in fact, in a few weeks. And so the importance of that has always been clear to me.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that. I mean, I did talk about that briefly in the introduction to this episode, but just tell us about that because that's so exciting.
Well, thank
Yay,
you. I'd love to. Thank you. I'm very, very pleased to say that I will, as of September 1st, be the founding director of a new interdisciplinary institute for public humanities at Hofstra University, which is an exciting new endeavor that they are putting together to welcome the humanities into the campus as a kind of swinging door, moving outward towards the greater world and bringing the greater world into the university and sharing what scholars do with the community and sharing community work with the scholarly community. And that's something I've been interested in my whole career. And now I get to help with a team build a way to make this permanent at Hofstra.
That's so exciting.
Yeah.
Really exciting. I'm very, very happy for you. And I'm happy for all of your colleagues that you'll be joining, of course. And I'm happy for all the students whose lives and minds you will be touching with this new initiative. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Those are really kind words. And I hope to be able to do those things with the collaboration of the wonderful faculty and administration of the university.
Well, I'm already inviting you to come back on in a couple of months. So you can tell us how it's all going and what's been happening. So, we'll get there. I will invite you back on.
With delight.
Yeah, I just love talking about these things and women who are achieving great things. So I'm very happy for you.
Thank you so much.
So just getting back to Dr. Ruth, I mean, clearly she did offer some advice to you. You said she planted some seeds in your mind. Anything else before we move on to Dr. Ruth herself?
Well, probably this connects to what you want to get to next. But in addition to all the exuberant, motherly and therapist-like interest I felt from her, she also conveyed through all of that a real gravitas, a real seriousness of purpose, which is part and parcel, I think, for her with the joy. Because we talked about her childhood in the Holocaust. We talked about the loss of her entire family. We talked about her being part of what was called the Kindertransport, the train that took Jewish children, mostly Jewish children, out of the way of the invading Nazis at the dawn of World War II. And she spoke very frankly about what it felt like to be a little girl put on a train to say goodbye forever. Not realizing that, of course, to her family. Yeah. And that extremely tragic past, alongside her joyful interest in promoting people's romantic lives, professional lives, and so forth, that left a mark on me and I think is worth thinking about a lot.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, if I recall correctly, all she had was possibly a little suitcase and her doll.
Her doll.
Yeah, it's quite a story, quite a background story. Everyone listening, I really encourage you to dig a little deeper into the history, the story behind Dr. Ruth. It will help you to understand, I think, a lot of Dr. Ruth. So Dr. Ruth was really known for so many things, of course, especially when it comes to sex. But she was known for challenging norms about women's sexuality at a time. I mean, think about when this was happening. Think about the context, right? At a time when we were still sweeping sex under the rug. Not that we're still not doing that in so many ways, but can you talk about how she really brought sex out into the open, made it a joyful thing to talk about? How did she do this? And why do you think she did this?
Yeah, it's interesting. To me, I think those years now, 30 so years ago, were not a time of total repression of sex for Americans. but a very narrow time for understanding sex and sexuality. And what Dr. Ruth was able to do is broaden the window for talking. By that, I mean, Americans are, there's a real Puritan streak in American culture, as well as a strangely prurient streak in American culture. And I think popular culture has always been, or certainly in the past 30 years or so, very sexualized or sensationalist about sex. But the real nuts and bolts of daily sexual communication between people, grown-up people, not movie stars, not models, has rarely been examined or had not been prior to Dr. Ruth with the tender care and open interest that she demonstrated. And it was also not in a textbook, and it was not just in a magazine. It was on the airwaves. It was on late night TV. Yes, she had a radio show, Sexually Speaking, which was interesting and fun. And she had a television show, more than one. But she also made it her business to appear on late night talk shows with people like David Letterman and Johnny Carson, who certainly did not expect this little lady to start talking about orgasm and masturbation. They would have starlets on, and there would be a lot of innuendo and so forth. But this was a way of, I think Dr. Ruth's biggest talent, I think one of the things she understood so well was that she could normalize, humanize, and add humor to matters of sexuality in a way that bypassed not only the censoriousness of puritanical culture, but also sometimes the sexism and the ageism of popular culture. And she did that really rather brilliantly.
Yeah, she really was brilliant. And I'm laughing because after she passed away a few weeks ago, there were some things on social media, like little snippets of when she was on some of the late night shows, like you mentioned, Letterman. And they just were so funny, like burst out laughing, funny, where they were so shocked to hear what she was actually saying. You could see them blushing. Like just really incredible. So in your New York Times article, which by the way is called The Irony of Dr. Ruth, and there will be a link to it in the show notes, everyone, if you have not yet read it, you wrote, and I quote, "Being a sex educator, though, would never have sufficed to create all this fame. Dr. Ruth owed her celebrity precisely to the incongruity she embodied, which disarmed audiences, distracting them from the discomfort and embarrassment that sex talk can provoke, especially in America, as you just pointed out." So it seems as though disarming people around her with all these incongruities helped her to talk about these sensitive things like masturbation and orgasm and clitoris and so on and so forth, and put people at ease about it. So anything more you want to add to that?
Yeah, all of that is absolutely true. She was the physical vessel that she was born into. Her God-given physical self was so at odds with what the content of her professional life represented that it drove people to laughter. And irony or just incongruity is when expectations meet surprise, right?
Yes.
And she knew every room she walked into, she created that even before she said anything. But then she would say things. And not only did she have an expert's opinion and vocabulary about sexology, she also had that accent and that very high voice.
High-pitched voice, yes.
The high-pitched voice with the old world accent.
Yes.
Was so also startling, disarming, that it only enhanced the effect. And I would argue that Dr. Ruth was really an actress, that she was a theater person at heart. She wasn't playing a role. She wasn't false in any way, but she was very well aware of what actors call their instrument, her voice, her physical presence, and she did.
And her timing, I think, was really impeccable.
Her timing is every bit.
Yeah, she had a humorous timing.
She understood her audience. And if you go back and watch her on David Letterman, who is famously sort of ill at ease about certain topics and very sort of buttoned up Midwestern, he is just tripping over himself trying to say the right thing. And he winds up saying some very witty things too. Johnny Carson, same thing, who also would be he would use a lot of innuendo with beautiful young actresses. But
right.
When a lady like Dr. Ruth was parrying with him, he was somewhat at a loss. And It's delightful to watch, and I think audiences love it.
In fact, I just realized I'm going to put, which I think would be a great idea, a couple of those clips in the show notes, everyone, so you can just check out what it is we're talking about if you haven't yet ever seen them. I'm sure you have, but this would just be a really great reminder of her impeccable timing, her ability to disarm, and her sense of humor. So really, her superpower was her humor, right? She made people laugh, as you pointed out, even when she just walked into her room and then started discussing these things. I also want to read another passage from your really terrific article you wrote. In retrospect, it's worth asking, what exactly, and this to me was really important, Dr. Garelick, what exactly was so funny about an older woman talking about sex with precision and frankness? Dr. Ruth was already over 50 when she became an iconic radio and TV personality, well past the age of pop culture sexual viability for a woman of the time. And then you go on to write, speaking of for women's and older people's sexual pleasure is a quietly radical stance. How often, really, do we encounter depictions of mature sexuality, especially in women, in television or film? Sex is still treated as the exclusive province of the young and the hot. Then you go on to mention a few kind of current things that have popped up in film and TV. But you know what? This is really the crux of the matter for me, is that what's so funny about that? There's nothing funny about it.
There's not.
Talk to us about that.
Well, thank you for reading that passage. I would even implicate myself a little bit in this because I laughed too, right? I found her
I guess we all
adorable, and it was discordant to hear her talk about sex. And when you saw her on TV, it was really funny. But I am rethinking that funniness now. I'm older now too, and I can't help realizing that women after a certain age are supposed to be somehow out of the domain entirely of sexuality. And I don't just mean this sort of pin-up sex pot version of womanhood, but Dr. Ruth was there to remind us that a sexual being is all adults, not just a cartoon version we have of sexuality, which is especially burdensome to women. I think we'll agree. And
we agree.
Yes. And being sexual has nothing to do with looking young and hot. It has to do with being human. And when a woman of mature years, well, I would also add, and I didn't put this in the article, but in retrospect, I think it's true. A woman of learning, of erudition, a scholarly woman is also somewhat, if not funny, somewhat troublesome still in our culture. And there aren't very many that you see publicly. And very often when you hear a woman with expertise and advanced degrees, she's called a school marm, or she's said to be hectoring. I think of Senator Elizabeth Warren and what people made of her during her presidential campaigning. So Dr. Ruth was never perceived that way because she was funny. But I think she may well have known that that was a way to get around that prejudice. And she was also breaking another barrier, which is reminding people that women's sexuality is lifelong. And she also did that for men as well. She talked a lot about middle age and late life sexuality. She wrote books about it, and she was very knowledgeable. But it was also a visual reminder that knowledge, expertise, and sexual vitality have nothing to do with age.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Not long ago, I had as a guest on the show Joan Price, who is a sex expert, and she really focuses on what she calls senior sex, people over 60 and the like, over 70. She herself is close to 80, if she isn't 80 already. And she's vibrant and happy and talks about her sex life openly and willingly. And it did amazingly well on YouTube. Like 500,000 people have already downloaded in a very short amount of time. And I think because they were so curious. If I recall correctly, the title of that episode is Sex After 60. Mm-hmm. Everything you need to know. It was that kind of thing. And people are like, what? And there were some comments, of course, that were, yes, finally, we're talking about sex after 60, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, there were those that were like, no, that's disgusting. Like, who wants to hear about my grandparents having sex? So you've got this whole thing still happening in this country and probably around the world, quite frankly, but I think more so in America, about sex later in life just shouldn't be talked about.
It's just an extension of sex shouldn't be talked about, right?
Yeah. Yes, I agree with that too.
We're a very ageist society. Sometimes I think ageism is one of the last acceptable prejudices to be openly talking about. You know, Dr. Ruth, in one of her books, and probably more than one, said a very interesting thing. She said, growing up in a Jewish family in pre-war Germany, her family was more European than it was Jewish. And what she meant by that was the European tradition of, especially Catholic or Christian tradition, would not have you talk very openly about bedroom matters. But the Jewish tradition is at odds with that. The Jewish tradition has always talked about sexuality as a normal, healthy part of marriage, of course, and that part is traditional. But she wanted to flip that script and said that she wanted to focus more on the Jewish aspect of her background, in which sexuality, including for women, is celebrated and a normal and a required part of marriage, certainly. It's the husband's duty in the Jewish tradition to satisfy his wife, and that's considered a mitzvah, a requirement and a blessing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I think we would all do well to remember that and expand it, of course, beyond just normative heterosexual marriage, which she understood as well, of course.
Yes, definitely. Yes. So what do you think are the most important lessons that we all learned from Dr. Ruth and hopefully we'll kind of remember from Dr. Ruth?
There were many lessons. I think one of her biggest lessons, she crystallized with the Hebrew phrase tikkun olam, which you may know, which means heal the world. And she felt it was everyone's duty to do that. And having lived through the tragedies that she did, she devoted her life to helping people have joyous, communicative relationships all through their lives. And so I think if she has one key lesson, it's that we have to use every bit of our lives and not write any part off and not be afraid to talk frankly about what we need and challenges that we might encounter, and to be joyful even in the face of sorrow or fear. And especially now, I think the world has changed even a little bit since I wrote that article. I feel a little bit more hopeful.
Oh, yes. Yes. It's only been a couple of weeks and oh boy.
Yes. Oh boy. And maybe a mature woman will save us yet. But I do think that meeting real cataclysm with persistence and grit, and also respecting our elders and respecting women of mature years, that's another lesson that we can all learn from Dr. Ruth.
Absolutely. Did you ever have the opportunity to meet her again in real life?
Sadly, no. And I weirdly always thought I might, just because many people I know have met her. In fact, after I wrote that article, one of my old college friends shared with me that he was a friend of Dr. Ruth's son, Joel Westheimer. And he told me a little anecdote about how, as a kid growing up, he didn't quite realize that Joel's mom was famous Dr. Ruth, because she, at home, when he'd come over for dinner, never, ever show her celebrity or talk about herself. She was just a sweet neighbor mother.
Teeny tiny one at that.
A very small, but packing a punch. So I never had that opportunity again, sadly.
But you did have that opportunity once to have that in-depth conversation. You're a very, very lucky woman. So
I was.
I love reading everything online. I love reading my daily New York Times, Wall Street Journal, everything. The Atlantic, my favorite magazine, little plug for them.
Love
it really is, right?
Excellent article today by Anne Applebaum, my college friend.
Yes. I should probably put that in the show notes too, but even though it's off topic, everyone. But I do love reading online because I love reading the comments. I love reading comments of articles that I found really intriguing to see, well, what do other people think about this, right? You get a real sense of America, I think, from all sides when you look at the comments. And so, of course, with your article, I also read it online and I looked at the many, many comments that people left. And some of them were they were so heartful, Dr. Garelick. They were so heartful. People loved her for all the reasons that you've been describing. And they learned from her, again, in the ways that you described. And we miss her already. I mean, she's a great loss to the world. She truly was a bright spot in this world. But I do want to read this one comment that I thought kind of summed up a lot of how we view Dr. Ruth. And here it is. In the late 80s, my eventual husband and I were scrolling through the Sunday morning radio offerings while riding in our car. We landed on Dr. Ruth. Dr. Garelick is correct. Dr. Ruth's age and accent captured our attention. Her words froze us to the show. Long after reaching our destination, we sat in our car, gape-mouthed, and listened. She said the word clitoris on Sunday morning, no less.
Yes.
It became our favorite thing to tune into on Sundays thereafter. So there you have it. You know, she just really like, wow, I can't believe that woman just said that on the air and on a Sunday morning. But then when you did see her visually on a late night talk show, for example, or her own TV show, or in a room at an event, and when she's giving a talk, she did disarm. And that really was her superpower. Disarm and then make us laugh, make us comfortable, and then educate us.
It's kind of genius. Yes.
Genius. Real genius.
Yes.
So this was, Dr. Garelick, so wonderful. Really, I could not wait to have this conversation with you. As soon as I read the article, I knew I just had to talk this through with you. I mean, someone who really spent that much kind of deep time with her. I really enjoyed this conversation so much.
Me too.
Are there any
Thank you.
like little takeaways you really want to make sure the Age Better audience remembers from our chat today about Dr. Ruth?
Well, I think we could all remember that this is a lady who lived to 96 and used every last minute of her blessedly long life. And it's a wonderful reminder that old age can be fabulous. And she is my new role model for that.
Yes.
Yes.
And mine too. Thank you again. And I know that you will be back.
With pleasure. Thank you, Barbara.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. If you enjoyed this episode of Age Better Podcast, please do a few things. First, share it with all your friends and family. Then, subscribe to Age Better wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, so you never miss a single episode. Finally, if you have ideas for topics you want me to cover in a future episode of Age Better, send an email to agebetterpodcast@gmail.com or reach out to me on social media. Until next time, remember this: we can't control getting older, but we can control how we do it. Talk to you soon. Age Better Podcast is a proud member of the Sound Advice Network. Sound Advice, women's voices amplified.